we also spoke with Ian Bremmer, president and founder of Eurasia Group. Now, he shares his insights on Russia's war in Ukraine and the spy balloon row between U.S. and China.
What does this latest saga mean for all of Biden and Xi's attempted détente?
Well, it is a big deal politically. It just isn't a big deal in terms of intelligence. And it's very important that we parse those two things out from each other. Remember, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, was well aware of the existence of this balloon. They knew what it was. They knew where it was about a day and a half before any of this became public. And at that point, Biden was still very much intending to send his Secretary of State to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping as well as other officials. And that obviously means they had no intention of shooting it down. The reason for that is because this balloon program is meant to be a backup for existing Chinese satellite surveillance capabilities if, God forbid, in the incidence of a military confrontation between the U.S. and China, China no longer had access to their satellite capabilities, which means that there's no further intelligence damage being done, but they are ramping up this program as a backstop. But once it became public information, given that in the United States, the U.S.-China relationship is so politicized and both Democrats and Republicans are very hawkish in their orientation towards China, well, at that point, Biden had to react immediately.
It's been a year since Russia entered Ukraine, and at this point, it's looking like Moscow is launching a fresh offensive. What is Mr. Putin's immediate and long-term goal here, and what would be a turning point for this war?
Look, I think the near-term goal is to try to have some wins on the ground that can show both the Russian people and also show the international community that Putin's military is more capable than it's shown itself to be over the course of the last 11 months. And certainly this is the first time that we're going to see this additional mobilization of a few 100,000 troops being put on the ground in the front lines fighting against Ukraine. The intention here is to try to take all of Luhansk and Donetsk. And these are two of the four territories that were illegally annexed by the Russians that they did not control all of just a few months ago. That's the intention of this new offensive. Whether or not it will be successful is an open question. Certainly, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, understands the existential risk that his country faces. And after he has announced that he's going to get tanks from the West, the next day, within hours, he says, OK, but now I need F-16s. Why? It's not because he's not grateful. It's because he understands that time is not on his side, that Russia has a much bigger military. They have a much larger economy.
Where do you see this alliance of Russia, China, and Iran going from here, given that the Ukraine war is a sensitive issue for Beijing, which has sought a neutral position so far?
I want to be very clear that Iran is providing a significant amount of direct military support for Russia. Iran has been maximally sanctioned by the United States and Europe. They are effectively decoupled from the advanced industrial democracies in the world. And as a consequence, they are functionally rogue states, both rogue states in the region that I presently sit in, the Middle East, as well as for the G7. Russia is also today basically the most powerful rogue state in world history. They're also being forcibly decoupled from the United States, from the Europeans. Their assets have been frozen, the central bank assets by the Europeans, by the Japanese even. The energy, the gas pipelines have been cut off. The oligarchs can no longer travel. They can no longer do business. That is the situation that Iran and Russia are in together. And as a consequence, they are very much allies of each other. China is in a very different position. The Chinese government does not want to be tarred with the same brush as the Russians or the Iranians on the global economy. China, of course, is more sympathetic to Russia's position in the war, but they also have been engaged in a charm offensive around the world, saying we need to still do business with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Japanese.
Picking up on your point on doing business with the West, Japan has been the main voice for Ukraine here in Asia. China, not so much, claiming to be neutral in the conflict, although there's little doubt to its pro-Russian lean. We also have South Korea. Despite having one of the world's fastest growing defense industries, it is still refusing to send Ukraine arms, yet it is selling weapons to countries arming Ukraine. And this includes Poland. Where do you think Asia stands on this war so far?
I think there's a big difference between the advanced industrial democracies that are nearly 100% aligned with the United States and NATO and China, which is very much aligned with the developing world. It's probably wrong to say that China is on the Russian side of the war. It's closer to say that China is actually aligned with the majority of the people on the planet, the 8 billion people on the planet, in the sense that they really don't want this war to continue and expand, but they absolutely won't support the United States or the West more broadly. China is still doing very robust business with the Russians, of course, but so is India. So is South Africa. So are all of the BRICS. You see the Brazilian president stand up recently, who's quite friendly to the U.S., and actually blame the United States and NATO for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, say they're partially responsible. Mexican president said the same thing. It's very interesting that it's not because they don't care about Ukrainian sovereignty, but rather because they see Western hypocrisy in supporting Ukraine and giving them $100 billion and doing everything they can to stop the Russians because they're white Europeans, as opposed to the Palestinians, for example, in the backyard here in the Middle East, or as opposed to the Yemen situation, or even all of the poor countries that have suffered so greatly on the back of the pandemic, on the back of climate change.